Hi, and welcome to the show, where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Tracy Asamoah. She is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, "It's time to focus medical education on training the whole person." Tracy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and your journey to where you are
Yeah,
today?
absolutely. Well, actually, I think the story is interesting in two parts. It's interesting from the very practical, technical aspect of I wanted to be a doctor, I think as early as I can remember. I actually started wanting to be a veterinarian and decided that I didn't want to deal with anything that crawled or was slimy or gross. And so ended up deciding that maybe I wanted to focus on humans and became really interested in working with kids and pediatrics. So I went through middle school, high school, and entered college with an idea that I wanted to go into medicine. Really thinking about doing pediatrics, got to medical school, realized that I was really interested in stories. I wanted to hear about how people got to where they got to, but from a standpoint of their thoughts and what they felt about it and their experiences, and wasn't so interested in labs and physical exams and all of that stuff. And so decided to go into psychiatry,
Mhm.
but wanted to stick with working with kids and adolescents. So went and did a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry after I finished my psychiatry residency. And from there, really thought that I was going to stick with the traditional, going into academics, working with residents and medical students, doing teaching and maybe doing some research, and just have this very kind of rigid idea of what I thought being a physician was. I was that kid that went straight through high school,
Mhm.
college, medical school, didn't take a break, ended up in doing academic medicine and did that for a few years early in my career. My husband and I eventually settled in Austin, Texas. And at that point, I was able to step back and take a look at what I was doing. Realized that I wasn't really interested in academic medicine as much, but wanted to do some teaching and do more work in the community. So I ended up in a community-based practice that was great. It had an integrated approach to healthcare. Our mental health clinic was located adjacent to a pediatrics clinic, and so it was a really nice opportunity to serve patients in a more holistic way. Unfortunately, it was a pretty toxic work environment, and it was toxic across the board for all of the providers and staff. And eventually, it became something that led to a lot of dysfunction in that particular setting. And so I found myself at a crossroads. And I think this is where it's interesting, where my journey is actually more interesting from a change in my mindset than it
Mhm.
is from the steps that I took. When I came to that crossroads, I had to make a decision. Was I going to stay in that work environment, which was leading to symptoms of burnout? I was resentful, I was detached, I was tired, or was I going to try to do something different? And I really didn't know what that different would be. I knew that I'd never considered myself someone who was going to do private practice, but I knew that was an option. And I knew that there were potentially other things that looked different clinically that I could explore. The thing that was interesting during that time period, the place that my mindset started to shift is most of my training and career, I had a very rigid idea of what being a
Mhm.
physician was. It was seeing lots of patients, teaching, maybe doing some academic writing, and that's what being a successful physician looked like. And I think I had this idea in my head from early experiences. I was raised by parents who fought in civil rights, and they wanted their kids to have a chance at being successful. And that meant having their kids go to college and get an education and become professional. And I really held on to that. That was
Mhm.
something that I thought I needed to do for them. But I also thought that the meaning behind that was what success looked like. And so becoming a physician that practiced in a certain way was where that took me. I also was a perfectionist. I've always been a perfectionist. And so I had to do things a certain way, and it had to be done on time, and I didn't want to get left behind, and it had to look a certain way. And so that really led to me going straight through and feeling like medicine and my pursuit of my practice had to look a certain way. And then I got to this crossroads and realized that it wasn't going to look exactly the way I
Mhm.
thought it would, and decided that I could do things differently. And it made me confront a lot of things. And I think that's how I found coaching, because I realized I was going to have to confront these rigid ideas I had about what it took and what it looked like to be a physician, I realized that I struggled with things like imposter syndrome, that I kind of always felt like I wasn't quite fitting into those settings that I was in,
Hmm.
and I had to take another look at that. But it really started to open up what I decided being a physician could be. And so I took a turn. I ended up taking about 4 months off and stepping back and deciding what made sense. And I
Hmm.
explored coaching, and that's when I started getting more interested in coaching. I actually decided I wanted to continue seeing patients, but wanted to do it my own way. So I opened a small private practice, and I started doing some writing,
Hmm.
and I do some contract medical writing now, and really decided that shifting my idea of what medicine looked like was and what being a physician looked like was the shift in mindset that just took me in a completely new direction.
I talk to so many physicians today who do exactly what you say. They shift their mindset and
Yeah,
they want to deviate from what a traditional physician used to be. How
absolutely.
difficult was that transition for you?
It was incredibly difficult because it was a mind shift that I had to make without a lot of knowledge at that point in time about all of the things that really went into me building up those previous beliefs about what a physician was. I had a lot of limiting beliefs that held me back from wanting to pursue things that didn't quite fit what I thought other people might think being a physician was. And so I had to really be able to step back and say, okay, if I'm going to do something that's sustainable and that I'm able to really dig into and have a passion for and build a career out of, it has to be something based on what I think a physician is in a very holistic, ideal way. And so I had to shift to seeing my training as not the endpoint. Becoming a physician wasn't my endpoint. It
Hmm.
really was a starting point based on me having experienced a whole bunch of experiences in training in my early career, gathering a foundation of knowledge and mental health, and having the background of practicing, practicing both in medical and community-based settings and academic settings, seeing that as these are skills and this is a fund of knowledge that I can use to create and build something different. That becoming a physician actually wasn't my destination. It was something that I could use to build what I could offer
Hmm.
with this set of training and skills that I had been able to gather over the years. And so it took some work to get there. It wasn't something that I just automatically jumped in. It took years, and I think that's what private practice allowed me to do, to be
Hmm.
honest. It was that bridge of me being able to do something that I had created and built, but allowed me to still serve in a more traditional role as a physician, seeing patients, as I discovered a little bit more about what that could really look like.
All right, so let's transition now into your most recent Kevin MD article that you
Yeah.
wrote. It's titled, It's Time to Focus Medical Education on Training the Whole Person. Now, for those who didn't read the article, can you
Mhm.
just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I've been coaching more and more women physicians, I have heard very similar stories that we identify the role of being a woman and being a physician in certain ways. And a lot of those things that we find ourselves stuck in are based on ideas that maybe came from other resources or other folks' expectations, but not so much based on what we ideally wanted for ourselves. And some of this, I think, comes in how we're trained. We're
Hmm.
trained to become really good diagnosticians, really good at understanding illness and disease, and really good at figuring out solutions behind really complex problems. But we're not trained so well in understanding how we show up as doctors and healers. We're not trained to understand the emotions that we might experience, the things that we might think about that limit how we show up as we practice. We're not trained to be leaders, and
Hmm.
all physicians in some capacity at some point in time is going to be a leader. And so when I thought about this article, I thought, gosh, it would be really great if the things I talk to the women about are taught as soon as we decide we want to become physicians. Like, why are we waiting until we've worked and we're experiencing burnout and we're
Hmm.
really struggling with perfectionism and all of these things that come up later in our careers to figure it out? What if we could do this as part of our training? So you're taking anatomy, but you're also taking something about leadership, and
Hmm.
you're taking courses in imposter syndrome and perfectionism. And so I wrote the article, kind of tongue in cheek about what if we could redesign curriculum, but really with this idea that the things that we end up struggling with later in our careers should be things that are brought out into the open and discussed as soon as we make that decision that this is the field that we want to work in.
Now, you talked about some subjects that a lot of physicians don't have any training on. You
Yeah.
mentioned things like leadership,
Oh, yeah.
imposter syndrome, managing burnout, work-life balance. So, what are some of the specific things? I would say, what are some of the top things that you feel physicians need training on after they leave medical school?
Yeah, one of the main things that I really wanted to point out in this article is that a lot of physicians get really good training on the kind of practical day-to-day aspects of seeing patients,
Hmm.
but not how we show up. So how do you show up as a leader? How do you engage with the team? How do you get a team to be cohesive and to allow everyone to have a role? And how do you inspire everyone behind the mission of whatever your practice or clinic is? How do you communicate? How do you manage your own emotional experiences as well as managing those of the people that work with you? And so some very practical things about social intelligence and emotional intelligence and being able to build a vision and hold and share and communicate that vision. So basic communication skills are
Hmm.
some things that I think we should be trained about no matter what setting. So, some of us will go into formal leadership and get formal executive leadership training, which is great, but leadership is a part, I think, of every physician's life at some point. So having basic training around that is really important. And then there are the things that are difficult. We live in a very difficult environment to practice medicine, and things like burnout continue to increase, anxiety, depression. So having basic information about what those sorts of things look like when they show up is really crucial. It's good for the individual. It's good for the individuals who work with the people who are experiencing those symptoms. It's also good for institutions because we know the data shows that when we have wellness programs that address burnout, that address stress, patient errors go down, physician engagement goes
Hmm.
up, physician satisfaction goes up, patient satisfaction goes up, revenue improves. It's good for every part of the system.
We're talking to Tracy Asamoah. She is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and a physician coach. She wrote the Kevin MD article, It's Time to Focus Medical Education on Training the Whole Person. Tracy, you mentioned leadership being one of the skills that
Yeah.
physicians need to develop. Now, if there was one actionable tip that you could share with physicians that could help their leadership qualities, what would that one tip be?
I think the number one thing is being able to be reflective on your internal experience. You have to be able to understand and reflect on and get curious about whatever you're experiencing emotionally, internally, because how you engage with other people, your patients, your coworkers, your staff, how you approach your work is all based on how you're experiencing your internal self and your internal emotions, how those thoughts and feelings are interacting. So understanding, being open about that, being curious about it, and then being able to make decisions based on that would be a starting point.
And if a physician wants to learn more about leadership, you talked about physician coaching. Are there
Mhm.
any online resources or any books that you recommend that they follow up on?
Yeah, I think the first place that I would start honestly is if you're with an institution that has programs that help with getting skills around physician leadership. I would start there. Books, that's a good one. I don't have specific books that talk about physician leadership, and I mean from the standpoint of just day-to-day leadership. I would actually start with things like looking at something like Kristen Neff's self-compassion book
Mhm.
of self-compassion, because again, it's starting with how do you experience your internal self. And so as opposed to looking specifically at books that talk about how to be a leader, because honestly those are going to look at things like how do you understand medical economics and how
Mhm.
institutions work. But where I would really encourage people to start in general, no matter what your position is looking at how you experience your internal self. And so books that reflect on that would be a good place to start.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Yeah, my take home message is to be open and curious about whatever you're experiencing right now, but to see your training and your position as a physician not as your end destination, but a starting point. And then being able to see and get curious about what could it be the start of? What could you be doing that would allow you to show up completely as who you are, to use your unique set of skills and knowledge to be able to be the physician that you really, truly, ideally would like to be.
And how can people reach you?
So my website is the best place to reach me. It's tracyasamoahcoaching.com. I'm also on Instagram and LinkedIn, so any of those would be great places to reach me.
Tracy, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight, and thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.